Namaste, Srimatre Namaha. Post-lunch session needs some energy, which is why we are going to invoke Shakti through the Viranganas of India. We might have forgotten most of them, but that brings me back to the whole continuum of the festival we have been a part of, Nandini and Shefali ji. So, we've learnt about our history, we've, learnt about the Purushartha, the whole civilizational, the structure of our society, and those three scintillating sessions about Operation Sindoor, and I'll never forget the kid who asked what we can do as citizens. Right? That is such a right way to think about it. We are sure that our future is secure when, the Gen Z thinks like that, right? So responsibly. And that brings me back, I really want your opening remarks as to become responsible citizens and to become leaders of tomorrow, Gen Z and especially women, they need the right role models. So before we go back to the past, let's have a bit of a focus on the present as to, where we stand with respect to having the role models for today's Gen Z women and also men.
Hello.
So how do you see the Gen Z developing their role models, right?
That's a very interesting question. I see a lot of Gen Z people here. So, whenever I go to colleges and I have a talk with the students, particularly to women's colleges, I usually show them two pictures. One is a woman in a business suit having a computer and typing on that computer. And the other picture is of a woman in a sari with flowers in her hair with a kumkum and everything. And I show them these pictures and I ask them, who out of these pictures do you think is more quote unquote modern? Okay, if I have to ask you the same question, a woman in a business suit with a computer and a woman in a sari in flowers in her hair and sindoor and all that. If I ask you kids, who would be more modern? Can anybody answer? Pardon me? Woman on the computer. Yeah, that's the most common answer I get. Then I tell the audience the identity of those women. The woman in a suit and a computer is just a model for a computer class somewhere. She doesn't have any great achievements to her name, whereas the woman in a sari with flowers in her hair is Tessie Thomas, the woman scientist from ISRO who was behind the Chandrayaan project. And then I ask them, now you tell me, who do you think is more modern? So then they willy-nilly come to the point and say, oh, the scientist. See, the whole point is modernity is not in your clothes. Modernity is here. It's not here. You can be modern. You can wear a Madisar, rock it, and still be modern or will be modern. And you can wear a miniskirt and you still can have the most regressive values and be perceived only as a showpiece for men, a victim of patriarchy. So, one thing I want all the young people, the Gen Z particularly, who are here, to understand is that tradition is not just in your clothes, it's in your thoughts. Conservativeness is also in your thoughts, and modernity, what you call it, is also in your thoughts. It's how you think, it's how you face the world, it's how you project yourself. That determines, quote unquote, how modern or how traditional you are. And we need to find our own role models, particularly the girls, the young women of India. We need to find our own role models. This is another question I ask, usually in a meeting like this. Who is your role model? To girls in 10th standard, 12th standard, college. Many of them say they are mothers, which is very good and very heartening to hear that their mothers are their role models. But after that, the answers that I get are almost always Hillary Clinton or some businesswoman, not an Indian businesswoman, some person, Sheryl Sandberg, the CEO of Facebook. And sometimes I get film stars, like somebody told me Deepika Padukone. हो सकता है किसी का role model, but so far I have never heard anybody say that my role model is Ahilya Bai Holkar. Or my role model is Rani Lakshmibai. Everybody knows Rani Lakshmibai. Or anybody say that my role model is Velu Nachar. It's not the fault of those young people. It's our fault. It's the fault of my generation because we have never told them these stories. Today's young children, they have heard at the most of Rani Lakshmibai. But how many of you are in Tamil Nadu, okay? How many of you know the story of Velu Nachar? Raise your hands. All the Chinmaya kids do. Great. But again, I'm saying, in a room like this, in an audience like this, I do not see 100% hands going up. That is a tragedy. And this is in a self-selecting audience. This is in an audience who is interested in these subjects. If I go to a general college and ask this question in a hall full of 500 people, maybe 5 people will raise their hands. You know that Velu Nachar was a queen who basically was the first one to fight against the British about 80 years before Rani Lakshmibai. She was also the woman who built an all-woman battalion called Udayal Battalion, right? Have you heard of a lady called Kuili? Chinmaya kids, no. Anybody else? Yes. What did she do? What was she famous for? Yes, first suicide bomber. See, today we hear about suicide bombing, we immediately hear Ola or Uber in our background, yeah? But this was a woman who really fought for a cause. And this was a woman who had agency. So that lie that's being told to us that in India women were always oppressed, India women were always a victim of patriarchy, in India women did not have decision-making power, is something that we have to dispel by giving concrete examples of our own role models, our own Viranganas.
Thank you so much. Shefali ji, always so eloquently put. I want to ask a similar kind of question. If I mention, I'm not going to give her name, but I'm just going to describe her. She was a young person. She was about 25 years old. She lost her husband. She had a little child. And she fought and won against a very, very powerful enemy. Who do you think I'm talking about? Rani Durgavati was a little bit older. I am talking about another Virangana, very, very powerful Virangana. You know what her name was? Maharani Tarabai. Maharani Tarabai, she was a Maratha queen. Shefali ji here is from the Maratha country. Maharani Tarabai, if you go and check, who is the queen who brought down Aurangzeb? Now, Aurangzeb is definitely, you don't have to, as a writer, you don't have to do too much to make him a villain. He was born a villain. So, for a person like that is being brought down by a young girl, 25 years old, a widow. Her empire at that time has been decimated more or less. Her people have lost fort after fort after fort. After her husband dies, they lose like 7 or 8 forts in a row. And she doesn't give up. So to me, this is at the heart of what I would call our version of feminism. Indian feminism, Swadeshi feminism, Naritva. Naritva, which does not consume Narivad. You know, our feminism, our idea of having agency is not, the Western idea of thinking of men as an adversarial force or thinking of agency as something where you have to take on the world. It's a version of feminism where we believe in what we think is right and we control our destiny. And that is something that our heroines have been doing for millennia. I mean, what do you think Draupadi did? What do you think Sita Mata's role was? So we have this tradition of Viranganas, and as I said, Rani Durgavati is my ideal. Anybody ask me who my ideal is, I would always talk about her because she is a person who takes agency in her life all through. She is a Rajput princess who goes and falls in love with a tribal Gond prince, marries her against her father's wishes, and when he dies, takes over and runs her kingdom so beautifully that her people turn her into a goddess. And then, when she is attacked by the mighty Mughal Emperor Akbar, his general Asaf Khan, she takes him on. And in the first battle, she gives him a nosebleed reply. It's only the second day, when her generals don't listen to her battle strategies, that she's taken down. And what is her rallying cry? Death before dishonor. This is agency. And I don't think a civilization that can birth as many Viranganas as we have can say that women did not have agency. That is just patently untrue. And Shefali ji was just talking about Rani Lakshmi Bai. We've all heard of Khoob Ladi Mardani Thi, wo to Jhansi Wali Rani Thi. We've heard of her. But do you know how many women Viranganas were part of the 1857 War of Independence? Hundreds and hundreds of them. Hundreds of them. And most of them were the aristocratic women, the royal women. Most of them were widows. Just like Rani Lakshmi Bai. Rani Lakshmi Bai's own main general was a lady called Jhalkari Bai. Have you heard of Jhalkari Bai? Jhalkari Bai was Rani Lakshmi Bai's friend, and she started a women's corps. And when Rani Lakshmi Bai had to flee for her life on her white horse Badal, it was Jhalkari Bai who impersonated her and fought till her death. So you have hundreds of these women who are completely unsung, whose roles have completely been forgotten. And it's not just the royalty, it's not just that they were all royals. Many of them were actually normal women, peasants. Many of them were courtesans, kotewali the. Many of them were, people who were working in the fields. They were agricultural laborers and so on. And they were invested in the idea of freeing our country from the British enough to give their lives. So if this isn't agency, I do not know what is. So if we are talking about role models, if we are talking about who we should look up to, I think we should go back to the pages of history.
Wonderful opening by both. So that's how I think secure and assured and rooted feminism looks like. In fact, I would not like to use the word feminism, the way it has taken shape nowadays. But anyways, going back to, the roots again, it brings me back, how the maternal aspect of the Indian woman shone through. And let's go back to Mahabharata, even older than that. So many people may not be knowing this, but when the war was imminent between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, Krishna is sent as the peace messenger. And after, the peace mission fails, then tell me, somebody is very, very disappointed that Pandavas wanted peace and sent Krishna as a, more than Draupadi, other than Draupadi. Kunti. So she meets Krishna and is like, why did you come? Why did they send you? What on earth is Yudhishthira thinking? What has happened to my sons? Right? And then she quotes a lady called Vidula. My sons are all trained as Maharathis, but 13 years in forest, has it softened them or something? So I quote a song by a lady called Vidula, how she inspires her son towards battle. Right? So that is how, women were not proud of their own husbands or sons if they turn away from their duties. Right? And same with Draupadi, and I'm moving on from the nurturing to the leadership element so in the Vanaparva, I think somebody quoted it yesterday, when Satyabhama asks Draupadi, how do you, all your husbands love you so much, tell me the secret. Satyabhama has the best husband in the world, but still. Then Draupadi narrates what she was doing as a queen. It's not just sitting on the throne and being an ornamental this one, but she talks about the administrative duties, she talks about the treasury duties, she talks about interacting with commoners. So she's like, I used to do this. So they realize my value. It means that, yes, they look after me very well, but I've earned every bit of it. Right? And I know Shefali ji, I mean, that runs in the continuum of our legacy. So yes, we've spoken about women on the battlefield, but women on the throne, I think Shefali ji has done extensive research on Ahilya Bai Holkar. So about the administrative abilities and rejuvenating temples inside and outside her kingdom. Right, that's something.
But before I turn to Ahilyabai Holkar, let me turn to somebody closer to this land. How many of you have heard of a queen called Sembyan Mahadevi? Okay, this is too much of an exam. I'm sorry. I keep asking you questions. How many? Raise your hands again. Again, proving my point. 100% hands should have gone up in a room like this.
At least a popular film comes showing her a couple of scenes. I think everybody should know her.
So Sembyan Mahadevi was the queen of Gandaraditya Chola and the mother of Uttam Chola. And after Gandaraditya passed on, she was the queen regent for her minor son. And even after he became the king, she wielded tremendous political power. And what she did is astounding. Not too many leadership figures today also have been able to do what she managed to do. She rebuilt temples. She built original temples, she rebuilt the older brick temples, and she started what is known today as the canon of Chola architecture, the standardization. Of course, later on, Rajaraja Chola built upon it, and that's why you have the big temple in Tanjavur, and in Gangaikonda Cholapuram, which are the finest example of Chola temples. But she was the one who standardized it. She was the one who rebuilt temples, built new temples, and she had such a sense of history. This is what I find it really amazing. She did not destroy the epigraphs that were there on the older temples. She preserved them. She added them onto the temples that she built, so there is a record of who built the temple before her. This sense of history, this sense of record keeping, this sense of leaving a legacy for the future is not something even today's leaders are born with, to have that kind of vision. She was also the person who is behind what we know as Chola bronzes, the enormous Chola bronzes that we have today. Of course, they were being made before her also. As somebody said, they were done by the lost wax, Madhuchishta Vidhan as it's called, that technique. But she standardized it again, and the enormous Chola bronzes that you find, those bronzes are thanks to Sembyan Mahadevi and her patronage to the arts. Not only that, she also made administrative changes so that single women, widowed women, women with minor children could donate to the temples, could have a say in the running of the temples, and they could give dhanams in their own name. Today we think it's easy that I, Shefali Vaidya, not Mrs. somebody, can donate something to an institution like Dakshin Vrindavan under my own name. Today it's normal. But this happened in 10th century CE. And in all her epigraphic notes, she writes Sembyan Mahadevi, I, Sembyan Mahadevi, wife of Gandaraditya, has donated this. So this kind of pride in your own identity, this kind of pride in your own name, the kind of agency that you have is really amazing. And this happened in 10th century CE, which I find really, really remarkable. Now we move on to her original question, Ahilya Bai. So the story that starts with Sembyan Mahadevi sort of, continues till Ahilya Bai. And Ahilya Bai again was a widowed queen. She was widowed at a very young age. She was barely 27 or 28 when she lost her husband. And in those days, by that time, the practice of sati was fairly prevalent among warrior families. And she was all ready to go sati. That is when her father-in-law stopped her. He said, you are very capable. The exact Marathi words are, Bai, maza unhala karun jates ka? Meaning, are you leaving me in a parched summer? I know you are capable of maintaining my kingdom. My son is dead now. You please come back. Do not go Sati, and you become the queen of Malwa. And that is exactly what happened. She became the queen of Malwa. And today, I see the women in my generation, and I include myself also in it, we become very stressed out over small, small things. The domestic help doesn't turn up, oh my God, I'm so depressed. I got stuck in a traffic jam, oh my God, I'm so depressed. My child has a little bit of a cold, oh my God, I'm so depressed. This was a woman who had nothing but adversity in her personal life. She did not enjoy probably a single year of pure happiness. Maybe initially when her husband was alive, but even there he had too many other women. He was not the right man for her, for somebody who was so virtuous and so strong. So even that marriage by today's standards could not have been very happy. Her son was, she had only one son. Her son was a total cause of shame for her because he was sadistic, he was addicted to a lot of substances, he was not a capable leader. And when he died, she actually said that with his death, he is also released and the people of my kingdom are also released, because if he were to be the king, the kingdom would not be very happy. This is a mother saying this. She had a daughter whom she got her married to a commoner who was a brave man, not an aristocrat. She actually put a competition and said, whoever tackles the bill problem in my kingdom, that brave person I will marry my daughter into. And she got a commoner as her son-in-law. And she kept seeing everybody she loved die before her. Her husband died, her son died, her son-in-law died, her daughter committed sati, her grandson died. So she saw all of this. Her personal life was nothing but a litany of sorrows. She did not complain. She did not blame her fate. She did not blame God. She said, okay, this is what is given to me, but I am not going to be a victim. I am not going to cry. I am instead going to treat my populace, my praja, as my children, and I'm going to look after her. And she was one of the best administrators that we had even today. Even she allowed widowed women in her kingdom to take a child in adoption so that they would not be treated as destitute. She made roads. She invited the weavers from Gujarat to Maheshwar, and the Maheshwari sari that you see, Jagan's mom is wearing a very beautiful green one, Maheshwari sari. So that Maheshwari sari, which is being woven even today, is something that Ahilya Bai herself designed. Because she herself preferred very simple designs, that is why Maheshwari saris are very simple even today. They don't have too many motif work, they do not have too much of jari. They just have a plain body and a very thin jari border. She built a palace. How many of you have gone to Maheshwar? Okay, quite a few people. But if you go to Maheshwar and if you see her quote-unquote palace, it does not feel like a palace at all. It just feels like a reasonably big home of somebody well-to-do. She was a queen of Malwa. And even in that palace, she lived in one room which is stark in its simplicity. It just has one mattress on the floor. Because she had lost her husband very early, she ate only once, she wore only white sari, she spent a large part of her day doing pujas. She had bare minimum needs. She built temples, rebuilt temples all over India, which were destroyed by the Muslim invaders, including the Somnath temple, including the Kashi Vishwanath temple, the Vishnupad temple in Gaya, all of these. She built ghats on the rivers in Maharashtra, in UP. She built dharamshalas. Her dharamshalas still stand all the way from Kedarnath to Rameshwaram. And she was not even the queen of a huge expanse in India. She was a queen of a little tiny thing in central India called Malwa. And she managed all this through her personal income. Because her needs were so limited, she wanted to build a dharamshala in Rameshwaram. But she was fair-minded to say that this money will not come from the taxes of my citizens, because it is not their desire. I want to do it for the Hindus of India, but I will do it out of my own private income. And yet, today, people come and tell us that Indians or Hindus have no parampara of philanthropy. How many queens? She was a contemporary of British queens which were very profligate, who did not repeat their clothes. And here was a queen who spent all her personal income in trying to build a legacy for the Hindus, not just of her kingdom, but Hindus all over India. And those dharamshalas, those ghats, those temples still stand today. That is the legacy of Ahilyabai Holkar.
So, and it should not be a surprise to know that this kind of, commissioning temples, rebuilding temples, and, looking at the administrative aspects of the kingdom, it's not just one superwoman who did that. We had such examples all over the country throughout the time. So, I'd request Nandini to shed light on the Gupta princesses, which...
So, thank you, Sai, because one of the most fascinating characters from classical India that stands out for me is a lady called Prabhavati Gupta. Shefali ji just talked about Sembyan Mahadevi. Prabhavati Gupta is also relatively unknown, relatively. How many of you have heard of Prabhavati Gupta? Okay, so there is just 2 hands. Prabhavati Gupta was the daughter of Chandragupta Vikramaditya, the great Chandragupta Vikramaditya.
And he's different from Chandragupta Maurya.
There's a millennium difference. So Chandragupta Maurya came nearly 1,000 years before Chandragupta Vikramaditya. So Chandragupta Vikramaditya's daughter, Prabhavati Gupta, was married into the Vakataka royal family. So Vakataka royal family is Western India. It was a very, very large, very prosperous kingdom. And she lost her, first her father-in-law and then her husband in very quick succession. And she had 2 very small children, so she became the regent, the queen regent. Now, why am I bringing up Prabhavati Gupta and how is she connected to someone like, say, Sembyan Mahadevi and later Ahilyabai Holkar or someone like Rani Durgavati? There is a very interesting copper plate inscription. It's called the Pune copper plate inscription, where Prabhavati Gupta is making a grant. Why is that inscription interesting? Because in that inscription, she is referring to herself. We know that among Hindus, when a daughter marries, her gotra changes, right? So the daughter, when she gets married, she assumes the gotra of the family in which she's getting married into. Here's the interesting thing. In the Pune copper plate inscription, Prabhavati Gupta refers to herself by her father, Chandragupta Vikramaditya's gotra, and not by her husband's gotra. So she is referring to herself by her father's gotra and as a Gupta princess. Is that agency or not? And this is happening roughly 1,600 years before Western feminists came up with the concept of feminism. Okay, and just like the other women queens that have been mentioned so far on this discussion, she was an exemplary ruler. So she ruled her kingdom for about 20 years. Not 1 year, not 2 years. You know, our section of our historians jump up and down about Razia Sultan. How many years was Razia Sultan on the throne? 3 years. How many years was Prabhavati Gupta ruling her kingdom? 20 years. So, you know, we see this continuity. We see her as an administrative and governing entity who was considered not only legitimate, but also very, very efficient and compassionate. And this is something that we see so we are talking about here 4th century India. Let's take a time jump and look at somebody like my favorite, like I said, Rani Durgavati, who came roughly another 1,000 years later. All right? And again, we see the same kind of trend. What Shefali ji was talking about, Ahilyabai Holkar, Rani Durgavati, we were just having this discussion prior to this panel where we were talking about how Rani Durgavati invited Brahmin scholars from across India. So she'd invited Dravida Brahman, so Brahmins from South India, and Panchadash Dravid Brahman, and she settled them in her kingdom. She also invited Brahmin scholars from Kannauj, and her Raj Purohit, Mahesh Thakkar, was later given a kingdom in Bihar by Akbar, and that became Darbhanga. And Mahesh Thakur was the first king of Darbhanga, and that's where the Hindu scholarship, the school of scholarship, the Mithila stroke Darbhanga school of scholarship came from there. So you have a lady who is not only scholarly, well educated, but understands the importance of scholarship. And we have several instances of court poets, of scholars in her own kingdom, in her own court, including one particular book that was commissioned by her. We have a copy of that book. It is currently there in Asiatic Society. Commissioned by her, called Prastab Ratnakar, which was meant for her son, for her teenage son. So she's commissioning books. She's got scholars, she's got Hindu scholars and purohits from all over the country coming to her kingdom. She's building temples. There are temples in Barman Ghat and other parts of Garha and Mandala which are definitively associated with her name. She did Mandir Sanskar, a lot of temples that were going to rack and ruin. She refurbished them. And there are multiple sort of references. There is a Ramgarh inscription which clearly says that she spent so much time doing yagna, doing in her sacred duties, that she was called Kamadhenu, like a goddess of fortune. So and in terms of just being a good administrator, she was responsible. She knew that her region, that Garha Mandala region, which is current day Jabalpur and surrounding areas, was very dry. It's not a very lush, not like Tamil Nadu, which is lush, green and very fertile. So she decided that she would encourage her people to turn more of that rocky forest land into good cultivable land. So she said that anybody who digs a lake and turns the surrounding areas into cultivable patches, can keep the land. And this very small introduction meant that the entire kingdom not only produced enough grain to feed its own people, it was exporting grain to Gujarat and to Dakhin. This is mentioned by Abul Fazl in the Akbarnama. So you have a dry patch of land which becomes a grain bowl and which starts exporting grain because she is intervening in water management and land management. This is smart governance, you see. So this is the kind of women leaders we have had who are not just not just brave, which they were, did not just have agency, which they did, but they were also excellent administrators.
And talking about water management, you would be surprised to know that most of the step wells in Rajasthan and Gujarat, one of the most arid regions of this country, are actually not built by kings, they are built by queens. They're built, even the very well-known World Heritage Site of Patan is built by the queen in memory of her husband. Not all were built by widows in memory of their husband. Some were built as public works, basically, because the women who were in charge, they were aware of the struggle for water in households better than the men, and they knew that women from ordinary households would spend a great amount of their day just fetching water for the household. So they were humane enough, they were understanding enough of this, so their intuitive understanding of water management and the need to create water resources was, I think, far more than the male counterparts. That is why one of the most important things that they did in this region was to build huge step wells to collect rainwater and to act as a water reservoir.
Rani Ka Bhav, no? That's also.
So wonderful. That was about valor, that was about leadership and administration. And coming to the next myth to be busted is about education and expression, right? And again, a Tamil Nadu related question. So, how many of you have heard about Muddu Pallani? Muddu Pallani. Only Swamiji has heard? Sure. So Muddu Pallani is now not a queen. She is a courtesan. And she has written one of the boldest Kama texts called Radhika Santwanam, which has got very bold expressions about lovemaking. And she gets this idea that, she has to, write this work. And the king, Raghunatha Nayaka, sorry. No, it's the Tanjavur Nayakas. So Tanjavur king, he says, he didn't say, why do you want to write such a book? No. Instead, he encourages her. He not only commissions the book, he also employs 2 scholars to help her compose it in poetry. So she acknowledges those 2 scholars' name for teaching her advanced poetry so that this whole kavya can be written in the chandas. So those 2 Brahmins, they sat with her, edited her work, and made it an immortal text. And that work was celebrated, in drama, dance, and all. Now, who comes and bans it? British. Right? And now the West comes and tells us, so, you women don't have right to express in India. Seriously? Exactly. So, even, coming to, the Muddu Pallani was one example close home. Another example, because I think those women also realized that modern historians are going to distort, so they thought at least some of them thought they'll record their own adventures. And Madura Vijayam, right? It is the story of Veera Kamparaya or Kumara Kamparaya, who dreams of Meenakshi Ammal coming and telling him, instructing him to uproot the Madurai Sultanate and win back Meenakshi. And somehow, there are some historians who tell, Vijayanagara is a foreign empire to Tamil Nadu. Literally, like Madurai Sultanate grew in the soil, right? Yes, this round will focus on the education and the scholarship of women of ancient India.
Can I just intercede for 5 minutes? I'm from Pondicherry, so you were talking about this courtesan. If you go to Pondicherry, there is a huge park in the center called Bharti Park. And there's a white monument there. It's a very French-looking monument. And that monument is called Ai Mandapam. I want to quickly share the story of Ai. Ai was a courtesan, very famous courtesan in that area when that area was part of the Vijayanagar kingdom. And there was a period of severe drought. And Ai was responsible. She was, as a courtesan, she was very rich. So she was responsible for digging the biggest tank just outside Pondicherry, and that tank continues to supply water to this day. And when Pondicherry became part of the French Empire, the French Emperor Napoleon III, somebody went and told, because they were demolishing existing structures and rebuilding Pondicherry. So somebody went and said, please don't do anything to this part because there is a memorial to somebody called Ai. So the whole story was narrated to Napoleon III, who was so impressed and he was so moved by the story, then he said that we will create a memorial. So that memorial still stands. If you ever go to Pondicherry, do go to Bharti Park and check out Ai Mandapam.
This education thing, so normally now the modern narrative is women in India, they did not have the right to educate themselves. There were no schools, they did not know how to read and write, and then the British came, and then the movement to educate girls started and whatever. If this was true, and when the British came, it was true that largely the standard schooling for women was not there. That is true. But that happened in that interim period because of the Islamic rule. But before that, if women in India did not know how to read and write, how did Rukmini write a letter to Sri Krishna asking him to come and rescue her? How did Shakuntala write a letter with her nails on a Kamalpatra to Dushyant? How are there sculptures of a Patralekhika, of a woman who is writing in both Patan Ki Vav, which was built in the 11th century, and the temples of the Hoysalas, which were built in around the 12th century or so? There are so many figures of the Apsaras, of the Surasundaris, and they are writing on a slate. How could this would have been immortalized in sculpture if there were no examples of it? Forget this. We come to Shivaji Maharaj. Shivaji Maharaj became Shivaji Maharaj because of his mother. Because when he was being raised by a single mother, she was the one who told him stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and who basically constantly told him about the injustices of the Islamic rule and encouraged him to fight. Now, if she did not know how to read and write, how did she know in detail about Ramayana and Mahabharata enough to teach her son morality, what is right and what is wrong? So there was a system of education. There was a system where women could learn to read and write. There were no schools in the sense of the British sense, Western sense, yes. But that too, because of the Islamic rule, there was so much of destruction, there was so much of atrocities on women, that this whole system of keeping women indoors largely happened after the advent of Islam in India. And this has been documented, by the way. This is not just me saying it.
That's true. A quick addition to what Shefali ji is saying. There are extant letters written in her own hand by Tarabai, where, the couple of words are literally in her own hand, in the medieval Modi script. There are also letters written by Rani Durgavati. So literally written by her, and we know from Abul Fazl himself actually that she invited Mahesh Thakkar to her court so that he would tell her stories from the Puranas. So if she was an illiterate woman, she would not want a very scholarly, erudite Brahmin to come and tell her stories from the Puranas. And again, if we take a time jump back and we look at the queens in classical India, we look at, say, Prabhavati Gupta and others, there is a very strong tradition of them being educated in statecraft, not just education in the sense of learning literature and poetry, but also statecraft. And there are, if you look at some of the sculptural examples that have come to us from the 1st century CE, which is from Chandraketugarh in and around Bengal, there are clear references to women writing, like you were referring to, on steles, on like slates, and they are writing. And this whole tradition of sending a letter to your beloved, Rani Durgavati herself did that. She sent her Bipra, which was her priest, sent a letter through him to her beloved, who was going to be her husband later on, and asked him to come and Haran Vivah her. So this entire myth that there was absolutely no education of women is not true. But obviously, as you said, because of Islamic invasion, women were kept increasingly indoors.
So as a concluding note, I just want to also, before I open the floor for questions, we have some time for questions. Okay. So, and also there is another argument that, education, okay, women are educated, you are quoting one queen, one princess there, here, only the upper castes had that privilege. And yesterday Dushyantji quoted the Telugu Ramayanas, one by Molla Ramayana. And Molla was not a Brahmana. She belonged to, her father was a potter, right? And she wrote, almost 600 poems long, 600 plus poems long Ramayana in Telugu. And, when we quote Ramayana, mostly our memory goes to Molla Mamba. And again, Ranganatha Ramayana, again, not written by a woman poet, but he is called Gona Buddharaja Reddy. who's a small-time Reddy king, warlord will be the. And then so most of the Ramayanas in Telugu were written by somebody who are not Brahmanas. So that is one and one by woman. So that's just one view of or outlook of how knowledge was actually all pervasive throughout Indian society. And yes, on that note, we'll open up for questions. Swamiji wanted to. So, by the way, the writer of Madhura Vijayam was Queen Ganga Devi. I didn't get to take her name. Ganga Devi, wife of Kumara Kamparaya or Veera Kamparaya, who's the son of Bukkaraya.
Big credit to our all sisters, especially thousands of years we have a struggle with Islamic invader. Not a single Sanskrit scholar, Brahmin or non-Brahmin, have anywhere recorded Islamic atrocity anywhere in the literature. And these main fellow, Brahmin, non-Brahmin, they were all busy in writing about the beauty of women, but they never mention anywhere the atrocity of this Islamic in this record. Only credit goes to Gangabai in Madhura Vijayam. She is the one who has recorded all the atrocity. That part we need to highlight. Coming to the, why I don't want to mention, because many of you are busy, because I am very critical to this point, because all these men scholars have never recorded anything. They were all busy in writing the beauty about the women, Second point, you are mentioning about the education of women in the higher education. I have written in my book, Malti Madhav, read the reference to Malti Madhav. Two bhikkhuni, they are discussing. We were trained under the same vice chancellor, where the our classmates have become ministers, So they also trained in the higher education, and those girls are not coming from their same village. They have come from the different area to study in the different higher institution. That is what Malti Madhav has mentioned. So there was a provision for girls for higher education, and there was an institution for them also.
Yeah, talking about that, there is a compilation of poems called the Therigatha, which is written by women monks in Buddhism. And if you read those Therigatha, Theri means female monk. The kind of themes that they have handled is really astounding. It is full of abstract philosophy, full of examples, very learned way of expressing themselves. So obviously, whatever the modern Marxist history tells us and whatever our evidence is, they do not tally. Before we open the floor for question, there is one queen and she's pestering me because she's saying this story is not complete without my mention, probably because she's from Goa and I'm from Goa. Her name is Nayaki Devi, yes. So she was the Kadamba princess from Goa and she got married to King Ajaypala of Anilwad, which is today's Patan in Gujarat. After her husband died, she was the queen regent to her son, whose name is Mulla Raja II, and he was just a 2-year-old baby that time. And Muhammad Ghori attacked Anilwad at that time. Muhammad Ghori was very sure, male arrogance, na? There is a 2-year-old baby who is a king and his mother is ruling in his as his regent. So the kingdom will just fall if I just snap my fingers. If I say surrender, they'll surrender. That is what he thought. But this queen was so strategically thinking that she chose the place and time of the battle at a terrain which Ghori's forces were not used to. She sent letters to all the kingdoms nearby her and said that my kingdom is very small, but this is a fight, not just my fight. If I lose, then you all lose too. So we have to get together and fight together. Then the third thing she did strategically was she realized that, okay, she is putting in a fight, do or die, but if she loses, then having seen how Islam treats captured children and women, she knew that she did not want her praja, the women from her kingdom and her children to fall in the hands. So she requested her surrounding kingdoms to take her kingdom's women and children, so that they would be at least away somewhere safe. And then she sent a large part of her army as deserters to join Ghori's army. pretend to be deserters. So they joined Ghori's army, and that is when she attacked. And when she attacked, the people who had infiltrated Ghori's army, they also attacked. And that is when Muhammad Ghori was soundly defeated in that battle. And because of that, he went back and he never attacked India from that side. If you see the letter history, he was the one who defeated Prithviraj Chauhan and all that we know. But he came from another side. He came from Punjab. He came from Delhi. But he never came back from Gujarat because this woman had defeated him fair and square. Jain literature describes her as Simharidayi Vidyavati, lion-hearted, knowledgeable woman. So obviously she had education, she had leadership, and she was a very brave queen and a very young queen.
The Solanki queens also. They are also. Yeah, Rudrama Devi.
Yeah, Rudrama Devi. One thing about Rudrama Devi, most of us know Rudrama Devi maybe thanks to that movie or whatever, but her sister Ganapamba was also a very able administrator. And the thing with Rudrama Devi, she never lost a battle till her last one, where she died, and by the time she was a grandmother. 80 years old. And Sampadanandaji
Yes.
wants.
So, adding to what Swamiji said about women education, we celebrate Chatushashti Kala, the 64 arts. Almost all the kalas are women centric, except few. And also, like the word Vidya and Kala are feminine, right? Vidya samasta tava devi bheda. So, Kalaha samasta. So, Sakala Jagatsu, all the Vidyas and Kalas are feminine in nature. So, that is the importance which is given to the women education. You can see Chatushashti Kala, how do we celebrate? This is what I wanted to add to what Swamiji said. Thank you.
There's a young friend here. Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, there's that young friend.
I would like to ask one question.
Can we just allow the youngsters to ask, please?
Hari Om, Ma'am. I'm a person who has studied in two different boards, ICSE and CBSE. And as Shefali Ma'am said, it's not the fault of the youth that you're not aware of these things. In both the history textbooks, I've seen a grave injustice taking place. Most of the British generals are prefer their title as sirs, but then Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj has not even been mentioned with this title many times. So what would you think would incite a response amongst the government to correct this mistake made by them in the history textbooks? Because that's the first information that we're getting regarding Indian history. And so many different great examples have been quoted by all of you. And when we hear those things, we are able to tell it to our friends, our people, our parents. But then most of the students in India, most of the students in a lot of places are not getting this information. And that is the thing that's keeping them ignorant of the rich history that India has. So what would be the things that the Indian government has to do, or what would be our duty to make the Indian government introduce some reforms into our history textbooks?
See, none of us are in the government, so we cannot give you a correct answer to this question. But if your question is, should history books be changed? Yes, they should have been changed 75 years ago. Very true.
No, but from your side, what you can do is read history for fun. Read history yourself, because if you look at actual evidence, primary source evidence, you will see where the story has been changed.
Another thing what you can do is and this is for not just true for education, but we don't take that effort. If something bothers you, so any civic problem also, write to your public representative. Keep writing. Because unless you become a pressure group and unless you put it out there in writing, outrage in closed halls like this is not going to really result. You guys are going to be first time voters in, I don't know, next
year.
election. So you guys should absolutely say ki this is important to us, and you'll get our vote only after these issues have been addressed. So if there is enough pressure, the government moves. The point is, we talk a lot in public, not you, it's a very valid question that you asked, but most of us, we talk a lot in closed halls, but we do not put our demands in writing. So that is, in a democracy, if you keep asking and form a pressure group, the government is forced to act. And as Swami Mitrananji said, things are changing. Like Chinmay Mission has, and I've seen those set of books. Those books are excellent, 6th, 7th standard, 8th standard history books that they have made.
No, I think NCRT is also changing the curriculum.
Thank you, ma'am.
Do you have a question? We'll take a question and then if we have time. The girl has a question?
Yeah, you can always meet us afterwards.
Yes. The girl has a question.
You told us a lot of situations where women were widowed and then the kingship that was originally their husband's passed on to them. But have there been ever any cases where directly a king or a queen was able to pass on rulership to their daughters?
That is your Rudrama. Rudrama Devi. So the father had 2 daughters, and there was a lot of pressure on him to crown his brother's son as a king. But he was very insistent that my daughters are capable and they will be kings. So he had to do Putrika Yagya to sort of, say that there is a divine blessing for it. But Rudrama Devi was the inherited queen of the Kakatiya Empire.
Also,
but yeah, there
there's
should have been
also
more
an
examples.
Oriya queen, Mahadevi. There's an Oriya queen also. Yeah.
And to quote Meenakshi Ambal herself, right? And this story is not a part of the main Mahabharata. I think it's a part of Jaibiniya Mahabharata or something. So there is a king called Meenakshi Ambal's father, Malayadhvaja Pandya. He participated in the Mahabharata war and he gets killed in the hands of Ashwathama. So after Pandavas win the war, Yudhishthira is taking care of, whoever fought on our side and got killed. He sends them special gifts and whoever is remaining in the family, he sends consolations and all. And there is a beautiful message by Yudhishthira he sends through Bhima to Madurai, to Meenakshi, who was a 16-year-old princess at that time. So he says, you are the only daughter of your father, so it becomes your duty to pursue one education, one arts, because don't stop enjoying life just because you are struck by a strategy. Then also get empowered, rule the kingdom. So here we'll offer you all the support that you want as the Chakravarti and all that. You take on, you should sit on the throne and remind your population about your father and let them not feel orphaned because they lost their king, because you are there. So that message to Meenakshi, it just has the message of women empowerment, encapsulated in that.
There's also Chitrangada. Chitrangada is another example.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to my wonderful panelists. I wouldn't have, been able to cover the length and breadth of this topic, without passionate historians. Thank you, audience. Okay, thank you.